right, so let's talk a little bit about ethical relativism. This is oftentimes a starting point for many people when we're thinking about ethics. Sometimes we'll feel as though morality is relative, or it's based on opinion, or culture, or region, or or ancestry, heritage, and so forth. So I wanted to go over what our text shares about that and how it explains why ethical relativism is really, and I'll sort of give away the end, it's an untenable position. So we'll share a little bit about this. We'll go over the text and talk about how our authors explain this. Some people do not believe that morality boils down to religion, but rather is merely a function of what a particular society happens to believe. This view is called ethical relativism, the theory that what is right is determined by what a culture or society says it is right. Right? So that's basically the definition of ethical relativism. It's the idea that whatever my society or culture says is right is what is right. Same with what's wrong, right? So now, by extension, what is right or wrong in one place may be wrong in another, because the only criterion for distinguishing right from wrong, and so the only ethical standard for judging an action, is the moral system of the society in which the act occurs. Right? Now, that sometimes on the surface can be a fairly comfortable position. I'm going to remove this because this highlighting, because it's distracting me. Oh, I can't do that. There we go. Because so yeah, it's a comfortable position because that enables us to say, well, you know, this culture, whatever they believe is right or wrong, is that's kind of true for them, or that's right or wrong for them. Maybe not for me, but that's the way that they choose to live their life, right? Well, and our authors give an example. Abortion is an example where, you know, in traditional Roman Catholicism, and certainly in Catholic Ireland, they mention specifically, is a problem. It's considered immorally wrong in many forms of Roman Catholicism, but in Japan, by contrast, it's something that's morally acceptable. We can also talk about other regions where we are in the United States. Abortion is acceptable. It's legal up to a certain point, and so forth. So now the relativist is not saying that the Irish believe abortion is abominable and the Japanese do not. That's simply descriptive. We're not simply saying, well, they believe this and they believe that. Rather, the ethical relativist goes a little bit farther and says further. And it says that abortion is immoral in Ireland because the Irish believe it to be immoral, but it's morally okay in Japan because the Japanese believe it to be so. Thus, for the ethical relativist, there is no absolute ethical standard independent of cultural context, no criterion of right or wrong by which to judge other than that of particular societies. Right? In short, what morality requires is relative to society. Right? All right. Now, actually, before I move along. Take a moment, maybe pause the video if you want, and think about where this can lead. What are the consequences of adopting that position? Saying that whatever a culture believes is right or wrong, that is genuinely right or wrong for that culture, for that region, for that context, for that society. Are there any exceptions we might want to draw? Are there any situations where a society or a culture has adopted broadly a moral position or some sort of social position that we would say is immoral, and we would insist that it's immoral? Can you think of any examples of that? Even if it's another society or another culture, or even if it's perhaps our own, and maybe perhaps our own historically. Think about those possibilities. Our text moves on to bring up some of those examples. Those who endorse ethical relativism point to the apparent diversity of human values and the multiformative moral code to support their case. Yeah, and that's laudable. We generally want to favor diversity. We want to make sure that we are inclusive as much as possible and tolerant as much as possible. But that as much as possible is an important qualification. From our culture's perspective, some seemingly immoral moralities have been adopted. Polygamy, pedophilia, stealing, slavery, infanticide, and cannibalism have all been tolerated or even encouraged by the moral system of one society or another. In light of this fact, the ethical relativist believes there can be no non-ethnocentric standard by which to judge actions. All right. Okay. So here are some examples. Right. So let's see. I'm going to skip ahead to where there's a description of let's see. Oh. does he mention? Oh yeah, here we go. Ethical relativism has some unsatisfactory implications. Right? So what does it imply? What does it suggest? First, it undermines any moral criticism of the practices of other societies, as long as their actions conform to their own standards. We cannot say that slavery in a slave society, like that of the American South 175 years ago, was immoral and unjust. We cannot say that as long as the society has held it to be morally permissible. So we see ethical relativism or moral relativism falls flat fairly quickly because it prohibits us from assessing the moral competence of any other social or cultural framework. It prevents us from saying that slavery was wrong in the United States and the South 175 years ago or so. All right. So it's advisable to move away from moral relativist positions because they lock us into a position where we have to say, well, whatever is right for them is right for them, whatever is right for us is right for us, and so forth. But that okay, what our authors point out here, ethical disagreement does not imply that all opinions are equally correct. Okay, now that's important. I know it's a little bit maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable because we like to affirm people's opinions. We like to say that, well, you have a right to your opinion. And sure, we do have a right to our opinions, but that doesn't mean that our opinions are right. Let me put it that way, right? So just because we're right to our opinions does not mean that our opinions are all right, right? So, so some opinions can be misinformed. Some opinions can be morally wrong. And so then the question is, then how do we determine that? And fortunately, there are fairly strong ways of determining that. And I'm going to skip over to another part of our text. There's some more, excellent analysis and criticism of ethical relativism here. I encourage you to make sure that you read that. But I want to skip forward in the text. Please do make sure that you read the entire chapter, of course. And I'm going to go to, let's see. Yeah, moral reasoning, the section on moral reasoning. Okay. Okay. Now, here, there's the text touches on some central elements of logic and largely deductive arguments. So, here's how it positions it. It is useful to view moral reasoning at first in the context of an argument. An argument is a group of statements, right? One of which, called the conclusion, is claimed to follow from the others, which are called the premises. Right? All right, so basically, now we're not talking about argument as in people are angry with each other and they're having some sort of knockdown drag out. We're not talking about that. We're talking about like making a case, right? So it's like you're building a case for some kind of position, or you're making an argument for some kind of point or some sort of conclusion. Colloquially, I like to call, a conclusion is very similar to what we would call a point, right? What's the point of this argument? And premises are very, very similar to what we would say reasons, right? What are the reasons that lead up to a point, right? And arguments tend to do that. Okay, here's an example that our authors provide. If a person is a mother, the person is a female. Fran is a mother, therefore Fran is a female. Right? It's a very, very simple, a very concise argument, and notice these are the reasons, in other words, the premises, the first two statements, and then from these first two statements, you get this conclusion. You can draw this conclusion if these first two premises are true. Right? If a person is a mother, the mother is female. Fran is a mother, therefore Fran is female. Right? Okay, so you see how mother means female. Fran is a mother, therefore Fran is female. Okay. First two statements of this argument happen to entail the third, right? Which means that if I accept the first two as true, then I must accept the third is also true. Right? Not to accept the conclusion while accepting the premises would result in a contradiction, holding two beliefs that cannot both be true at the same time. And in a way, that is one of the fundamental I guess you could say doctrines, right? One of the fundamental principles associated with logic. We want to avoid as much as possible contradiction. Right? We want to avoid. Now, if we adopt several positions that, when we look at what they lead to, what they lead to is contradictory, then we need to revise our beliefs. We need to revise our positions. Okay. Now here's another word that is dropped, and this is very common in logic. Oftentimes when we think of validity, we think of something that maybe means that it's acceptable or makes sense or so forth. Here, there's a much more specific, much more discrete understanding of validity. A valid argument is an argument whose premises logically entail its conclusion. So in other words, if the conclusion really does necessarily follow from the premises, then it's considered a valid argument. Right? By contrast, an invalid argument is one whose premises do not necessitate its conclusion, do not entail its conclusion. An invalid argument, in an invalid argument, I can accept the premises as true, but reject the conclusion without any contradiction. So here's an example of invalid argument. Argument 2. If a person is a mother, then the person is female. Fran is a female, therefore Fran is a mother. Right? Now notice, this is invalid because you can accept the first two statements. That you could accept this rule, if a person is a mother, then the person is female. And you can also accept this statement, Fran is female. But that does not necessarily mean that Fran is a mother. Right? Do we see this? I hope you can see. If you could almost imagine this contingency relationship. If a mother implies female. Fran is female, but that does not mean that Fran is a mother. Right? Okay. All right. Now, this mistake, right? Again, once argument 2, this is an invalid argument. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. And unfortunately, we make mistakes like this very regularly in our own thinking. Now this one, it's obvious that it's invalid, but there are lots of times when we'll sort of utter an argument or we'll form some kind of conclusion based on premises that actually do not lead to it or do not necessitate it. Right? So, errors abound in our own thinking, and it's very helpful to revisit some of these key core logical principles in order to grow and improve in our ability to offset or prevent these kinds of mistakes. All right. So carrying on, the conclusion of the argument does not necessarily follow from the true premises. I can believe that every mother is female, that Fran is a female, but deny that Fran is a mother without contradicting myself. Right? So this conclusion is invalid. Right? All right. One way to show this is by means of counterexample. Counterexamples are enormously helpful when we are evaluating an argument or evaluating some sort of doctrine or principle or idea. Okay, so the text goes on. An example is consistent. An example that is consistent with the premises but inconsistent with the conclusion. Right? Let's suppose Fran is a 2-year-old and a premise that is perfectly consistent with the two stated premises. If she is a 2-year-old, she can't possibly be a mother. Right? Or let's suppose Fran is an adult female who happens to be childless. Right? All right, so we think of some counterexamples. Right? Now you'll notice that in our discussions in class, we've already been doing this. Right? This is something that that should be natural to us. Right? When we think about some kind of argument or some sort of case, we should almost right away start to wonder whether there are counterexamples. And of course, we're talking about relevant counterexamples. We're not just talking about anything what you want to throw at the wall. We don't want to do that. We want to look for serious, relevant counterexamples that relate directly to the argument being made. And of course, let's see. Yeah. Okay. Oh, here you go. A valid argument can have untrue premises. Right. So now here's where we're going to start to talk about another important quality of good logical arguments, and that's going to be what we call soundness. So let's talk a little bit first about a valid argument, where, in other words, a valid argument, as a reminder, is where the conclusion follows from the premises. However, it may be that one of the premises is false. Notice earlier, we haven't necessarily been checking for whether each of these premises is true. We're just saying that if we accept these as true, then the conclusion must be true. But here, now, we're going to look at a valid argument, one of whose premises is not true. And that is this one. Notice, if a person is female, she must be a mother. Now, that is not true, right? Because there are all sorts of exceptions to that, right? So there are lots of females who are not mothers, right? So it's not true that if a person is female, that she must be a mother. But notice the whole argument. If a person is female, she must be a mother. Fran is female, therefore Fran must be a mother. So notice if you accept the first two as true, then the third statement, the conclusion, naturally and necessarily follows. But there's still a problem with the argument because the first premise isn't actually true. Okay, so here, again, as the authors move on, like argument one, this argument is valid. If I accept its premises as true, I must accept its conclusion as true. Otherwise, I will contradict myself. However, although argument three is valid, it is unsound. Because, unsound because of its premises. Because one of its premises is false. Right? We just went over that. Okay, so when we're looking for good arguments, we want to make sure that they are valid. That means that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. We also want to make sure that they are sound, and that means that the premises are in fact actually true. Okay, we got to check for both of those things when we're assessing a moral argument, assessing an argument. Okay, now so far these have not been moral arguments, right? These have just been sort of factual claims, right, in a way. But now let's talk about what makes an argument moral. What makes an argument moral is that it contains at least one premise that makes some kind of moral statement. Right? So in this one, argument 4, that our authors give us, if an action violates the law, it is morally wrong. Okay, there we go. There's the moral statement. That's a claim about ethics. Now, moral claims can take other forms. They don't necessarily need to have the word moral in it. Sometimes a moral statement could have the word, it may have the word should, right? Then one should not do it. Or it may include the words good or bad or right or wrong. Sometimes they may include language that relates to value and so forth, or importance, or maybe purpose. But largely with moral arguments, there's going to be at least one moral premise, one moral statement in it. And that as long as that premise is relevant to the conclusion, that makes the entire argument a generally moral argument. Right? Typically, the conclusion will be a moral conclusion. All right, so here we go. Let's follow along this argument. If an action violates the law, then it is morally wrong. Affirmative action on behalf of women and minorities in personnel matters violates the law. Right? That's the second premise. All right. Now, whether you consider that true is not necessarily relevant here. We're just looking at it being a moral argument. Right? We're looking at the qualities of moral argument. Therefore, now typically, a conclusion in a formal argument will usually begin with therefore, but it could also begin with a word like so or thus and so forth. Right? Lots of different ways to signal that you're offering a conclusion here. Therefore, affirmative action on behalf of women and minorities in personnel matters is morally wrong. So notice, if I take these two premises, if an action violates the law, it's morally wrong. Affirmative action violates the law. Therefore, affirmative action is morally wrong. Now, we started to talk a little bit in class about the situations where something could violate the law, yet it could be morally right. And we talked about that. Right? There are some laws that are very unjust. I'm getting low on time, so I don't want to take up too much time. But let's see. In a minute, let me just encourage you to go through the rest of this section on moral arguments. Right? It's very, very important, and we'll be continuing to refer back to these principles related to logic, and of course to moral arguments regularly throughout the course. Let me just say, for ahead of the quiz that's coming up, please make sure that you read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. Both read the letter, but also read what our text says about it, how our text analyzes it and describes it. Also read the article at the end of the chapter on good business by Robert C. Solomon. All right, just make sure that you do those things, and then you'll be ready for the quiz and for our future discussions in the class. I hope you're really enjoying this, and there is much more to come. I find it fascinating. I hope you do too.